Elora burned, dreamed, flew. She cheered as the chrysalis brought forth her ultimate incarnation. She spiraled away from the Elora she'd been, unwilling to take a backward glance, more excited about what lay ahead than what had come before. She felt like molten metal cascading from pore to mould, full of potential, yet lacking a final form. Her imagination brought forth all manner of choices. She thought of becoming as strong and resolute as Corey. She thought of the mother she'd never seen, wondered what part of her echoed those features. She thought of not being human, and remembered the delight she'd found sharing consciousness with Anil and Bastian. She became aware of claws and fangs, not part of her body, but an extension of her inner being. The pure metal of her forging darkened. Angry blotches ate away at her, leaving a void filled with cruelty and passion. All her emotions twisted a fatal turn off centre, so that desire became lust and anger, rage. There was a yearning for love still, but that love looked more to the shadows for fulfilment. It found joy in pain, delight in the flash fire of terror from prey that knew it was doomed. She heard what passed for laughter, and first thought this was a presentation of the Malavoy. Then she shook herself from top to toe, eager to cast off the last remnants of her prior existence and embrace what was newly offered her. She noted pinpoints of light in the darkness. As they got closer, the shapes resolved themselves into beasts. Death dogs, the Malavoy's favoured pets. They waited eagerly for Elora to become one of them. A splash of radiance tore across her vision from the side, bright enough to blind. It caught the death dog nearest Elora. Her throat tore as she echoed its cry. It toppled backward, its shadow substance eaten away by that pure light. The eyes gathered around Elora, as though the pack were trying to coalesce into a single mass in her defence. She beheld more bursts of energy, felt the sympathetic pain of each dog's passing. There were two sources. She could tell that from the trajectory of the bolts, but what they were remained hidden. The dogs seemed to draw their sustenance from Elora herself. While she accepted the bond between them, the pack could not totally be destroyed. Moreover, the dogs could see what she did, that the bolts of light were gradually weakening. Their attackers still possessed the power to inflict grievous harm, but their resources were finite, and that end was in sight. Elora called on her mage sight to see who was slaughtering her pets. She hissed at the sight of them. They were brownies. The one on the left wore a pair of swords, carved from the fangs of a death dog he'd slain. His clothes were leather, finely tanned hides that fit like a second skin. In his hand he held a bow. This was Rule. Beside him walked Frangine. "You!" Elora cried, voice more resonant of Malavoy than Daikini. She'd never dreamed a single word could embody such contempt. She didn't care. These things that were less than pecks were no fit foe for her. It was an insult that they did such damage to her lovelies. "For you," said Rule, "we dare anything." "So, Elora Danan," noted his companion, "has it come to this?" The brownies looked gaunt, and she realised that was because their energy bolts were fuelled by the essence of their own lives. For each dog they slew, a portion of themselves perished with it. She flashed fangs at them, and the dogs who remained followed suit, breaking the darkness with points of gleaming ivory. The dogs flowed outward from Elora, moving to the side as well to flank their foes. They hungered for even a brief chase before the kill, but the brownies stood their ground. Again, Elora burned from the inside out. It was as if she'd plunged herself into the molten heart of the world, her only grasp on coherence, the primal sense of self. She could think, therefore she had to exist. From that thought, the instinctive "I am" came form and a kind of substance. As she cast her senses wide, she found that the fire was home to score beyond score of similar creatures. They popped in and out of view, winding themselves around and occasionally right through one another. "I know you!" she cried. "Know you!" replied one, and the cry was quickly taken up in a madcap chorus. "Know you! Know you! Know you!" It was worse, and yet more wonderful, than being swamped by puppies as the fire drakes crowded around her. Overjoyed, that she had chosen to join with them at last. "The first realm is fire," she whispered. "Fire! Fire!" she heard, and then, "Burn! Burn!" "The world burns," she continued, remembering the last time she'd encountered these creatures, so uncontrollable that even the most powerful of magi gave them a wild birth. She alone was able to call fire drakes to her side and restrain their urge to set all creation ablaze. They had spared her life on one occasion, and she had saved a clutch of theirs on another. "The world burns," Elora repeated. "We burn. All things burn." Wings exploded from Elora's back, a tail from the base of her spine, limbs elongated, losing none of the fire drake's liquid grace, but gaining the majesty of solid form. She grew tremendously in stature, and in the process gathered into herself the fire that surrounded. Once more she found herself returned to the dark place where the death dogs dwelled, and recognized it as a corner of her own soul. The pack was closing on the brownies. Elora wanted to fly, but knew it was too soon. Instead, she let loose a terrible cry to announce her presence. She knew the dogs would turn on her, to reassert the dominion of that part of her which was bound to them. She opened her mouth and hosed the ebon space before her with the fire she'd brought from the heart of the fire drake's world. She was a dragon now, and this was what dragons did best. There were no eyes facing her when she was dumb, nor, sadly, any sign of her brownie friends. She had won a measure of freedom. She was alone. The fire faded, within her as without. The dragon became a young woman, huddled on a patch of icy flagstone, in the remnants of a dancing costume whose scarlet colour matched the blood that covered the cloth. She reached for her bear, desperate for comfort, but her hand found only emptiness in her travelling pouch. Belatedly, she remembered where she'd left it, and cursed herself for such a foolish gesture. Darkness loomed, crashed down on her like a rogue wave at the seashore. She was caught in its fierce undertow, jounced so hard that awareness fragmented like a shattered mirror. Before she knew it, all those broken pieces were swept beyond her reach. In desperation, she grabbed for one, and worked her tongue past teeth that seemed to have grown fur, to touch lips gone so dry they felt dusted with stone. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. That took more strength than she had. She was too tired to turn to insight and meld her consciousness with another's. She had a sense of something flickering off to the side, concluded that there was a hearth blazing across the room. She wasn't naked. She felt the presence of a long nightgown. She twitched her lips as something damp pressed down on her forehead. "Not so much, child," she heard Thorn say. Her needs were as simple, her wants as direct, as a nursing baby's. There was a sprinkling full of water as Thorn dipped the cloth in a handy bowl and returned it to her. "I'm afraid you can't handle a proper drink," he went on. "We have to feed you a bit at a time, no more than that." She grunted, tried to crease an eye open. "As you may have surmised," Thorn related, "Corey won the day. We emerged from the gate atop a Shados highland beyond the Cascadel." The Shados were the mountain range that filled the horizon below Saint-Denis, and the Cascadel the greatest river of the western half of the continent. "Where?" Elora began, amazed to find that speaking that single word left her exhausted. "Fort Trigar." Her first sight of it, she remembered, had been through the eagle's eyes. When last she'd seen the fort, there had been a scattering of individual homesteads, off by the tree line where additional land had been cleared for crops. As she replayed her own memory of the scene, she found it accompanied by an addendum from Thorns. The farms were gone, reduced to smouldering timbers. "Don't talk," Thorn cautioned. "As if," Elora husked, "I could." All her efforts for minutes after this were devoted to recapturing her breath. There were blank spots in her awareness, grace notes marking the passage of time, telling Elora that she'd fallen asleep without her even noticing, sometimes right in the middle of thought. Let that be a lesson to you, child, Thorn said quietly. You're hurt. His tone told her that her condition was grave beyond description. She tried to see Rule, but the brownie had positioned himself, deliberately, no doubt, rot him, beyond the track of her eyes. Myself, offered Frangine from the opposite direction. I'm thinking she'll look quite stylish on a dais in a gallery. Secret princess reclining, au naturel in silver. She wanted to hit him, but all she could manage was a rude squeak. Someone leave a kettle on the boil? Asked Rule in all innocence. More like a mouse, Frangine said, daring us to the hunt. We are slayers of death dogs, Rule pronounced. We do not hunt mice. That's enough, the pair of you, chided Thorn. Look at Elora. You'll do her an injury with your japes, making the poor girl laugh so. Suddenly, Rule was standing by her collarbone. She'd misplaced her memory of how quickly the brownies could move. More proof of her infirmity. Laughter, you say? He scoffed, assuming a dollop of Frangine's manner. Don't appear so to me, though I'll concede the barest ghost of a grin touching her mouth. Frangine joined him. I dreamed, Elora managed to say. You did? Rule said, his tone turning serious. There's a hook in you, Elora Dannon. He didn't have to say whose hook. This was a power so feared he dared not speak its name. Pack comes at your calling, sits at your feet, kills at your bidding, shows you the nature of the beast. Bad business. You defied them. Too dumb to live, that's us, said Frangine. Think we'd let the likes of them lay claim to our princess? Said Rule. No more, and Elora gritted her teeth. Then I would allow either of you to come to harm. She didn't know how long she'd slept, but was thankful there were no more dreams. As consciousness returned, she enveloped herself in purely physical sensations, noting the pops of wood in the hearth, the tang of hardwood smoke. She had called on the meditation exercises Thorn taught her to soothe her spirit. She reached out to the special power that was her own and spoke to her body, reminding torn flesh of what it had been like to be unscarred, hoping that the act of healing her physical being might help her soul. It was a clumsy process. To Elora's dismay, she had no stamina. She would complete one session of treatment and promptly forget what was next on her agenda. A seductive languor would come upon her, and suddenly whole stretches of the day would vanish in a flash. Her shuttered windows would be bright with sunlight one moment, then the next the room around her would be painted in layers of midnight shadow. She understood fever and exhaustion, but in neither case had Elora ever felt anything so profound. To her annoyance, none of her friends apparently had interest in helping her be free of it. 3 times a day, Thorn would visit her bedside to check her pulse. He offered herb tea to take the edge off her wound pain. Gradually, without realizing, Elora slipped into a coma, a sleep so profound that some of those caring for her muttered that she would never awaken. Only Thorn, Corey, and the brownies knew differently, that Elora had withdrawn inside herself to marshal all her strength for this battle. But that knowledge was torture for them, because there was precious little they could do to help. You just gonna let her fade away to nothing? Flared Rule to Thorn, as the Nelwyn gently bathed Elora's brow. I'm open to suggestions, was the calm reply. Fangs, Nelwyn, you're the sorcerer here? Tell me what herb to find, it's yours. Cast some bloody spell. Say her, damn your eyes. She's immune to magic, Brownie, Thorn said, bespeaking an anger only barely restrained. You've known that from the start, the Nelwyn continued, long as any of us. My enchantments have no hold on her, save perhaps to add a portion of my own strength to hers. But even their Rule, she has to ask. If she doesn't reach out for aid, I can't force it on her. What happens if she dies then, Drumheller? What of the world, if its saviour is no more? I don't know, Frangine. For the first time, a doubt surfaced in Thorn's thoughts. Suppose prophecy is wrong. Suppose we've made a mistake, and she isn't the one. Angrily, he thrust that heresy aside, only to find himself confronted by a wish wrapped in the stale, tired air of the Malavoy realm. Perhaps it would be better for us all if she did die. With all his own strength, he denied both thoughts and banished them. As for Elora, once more she burned and flew, and it was glorious beyond imagination. Her wings thrust her through the molten heart of creation. Her first thought was to label this a dream, but experience taught her it was far more. Dreams were how the dragons travelled to other realms. Here was where the world that was could be transformed by the hopes of the dreamers into that which might yet be. For Elora, this visit, that meant a world without strife, where there was no war, where the fate of everything no longer rested on the shoulders of one girl who considered herself ill-equipped. No one could demand things of her. No one had to die for her. She was at peace here. There were no more dragons. If the egg in her pouch wasn't allowed to hatch, there never would be again. No people either, because each face she conjured from the vault of her memory carried a reminder of tasks left unfinished. There was simply the world, a playground all her own, to remake as she pleased. A flaw in the smooth curve of the horizon caught her eye. She came closer and noticed the mountains rearing violently upward from the surrounding landscape, like sear points, bringing first warning of an invading army. Something about the sight poked at Elora's recollection, but the specific memory proved fiendishly elusive. She beat her wings skyward to get a view from above, which revealed a central valley, but she couldn't bring herself to overfly the mountains directly. Interesting, Elora told herself, as she saw how the natural arrangement of these peaks reminded her of a castle fortress with the valley its central courtyard. She never realized that, for all the time she was close to these peaks, she never once turned her back on them, that during the descent she always turned toward them. When at last her feet touched the ground, her dragon form melting to reveal her human figure, she was a fair distance removed from the range. The mountains remained an imposing sight at the horizon, but she didn't stand in their shadow. Somehow, this too seemed important. She'd landed on rich earth by a stream, enveloped by air. All that remained was fire to complete the four great realms that comprised the first circle of being, that of the world. Elora cast forth a piece of herself into the ground. She thought to find friends there, the community of demon fire drakes who'd adopted her, and was saddened to discover that the world's core was uninhabited. The second circle, that of the flesh with all its myriad peoples, had yet to touch this place. Elora had bonded with each of the great realms of the world in their turn, offering a portion of herself to them and accepting part of them into her. Many thought that since Elora was sacred princess, that meant accepting the fealty of the great realms as their sovereign, but hers had never been the power to command. She couldn't force anyone to do anything. "Do not despair, Danon. There is no need." She stirred at the sound of that familiar, tantalizing voice. A glance upward revealed that the mountain range had grown or moved. What had been a safe distance removed was now on her doorstep, slopes rising so high she couldn't even see the summits beyond. "Come to us, child. Join with us. Let it be thy foes who art brought low, for now and evermore." With those words, her fatigue was gone. This was enticement and promise. All she had to do was rise to her feet, and a path would be revealed to her through the mountains. With each step would come Malavoy strength, until at last she reached the central valley. "We are the old, thou art the new. Learn from our experience, Danon. Let us be reborn with thy youth. Take of our stronghold and make it thine own. Here wilt thou ever be safe. None can do thee harm. All wilt pay thee homage. This war shall end in a twinkling, in a trice. Victory will be thine. So much to gain, so small an act to bring it to pass." It was the longest speech she'd heard from the Malavoy. It gave her pause. On the one hand was salvation as a gift, offered freely, but she knew there'd be a price. In the other, she held deliverance of her own making. No guarantees here, and in its own way, the price exacted would be higher. She didn't want to make the choice. She heard a growl that resonated through her bones. There was warning to it, and challenge, and a heritage of enmity reaching back over a score of aeons, to the moment the circle of the world gave rise to that of the flesh. It was a gauntlet the Malavoy recognized, and it responded with a snarl of its own. Elora swept her eyes around for a glimpse of the growl's source, but found the world as empty. There was a path now into the mountains. Simply looking toward it made her blood sizzle with anticipation, and she suddenly could swear she heard the faint baying of death dogs. They wanted to follow her, not as prey, but as their leader. "No!" she said aloud, meaning her refusal to be final and absolute, but her thoughts betrayed her with a qualification. Not yet. Anger got the better of Elora then, and she paid for it in full measure. With a reflexive snarl, she thrust the fire she'd caught into the centre of her chest. Each pump of her heart cast forth a jet of flame, surging down the great vessels to her toes, then back again to the crest of her skull. She felt her body arch like a drawn bow until she was poised on heels and head, at last giving voice to the fire, threatening to consume her with a bellow that encompassed the whole spectrum of pain. In that moment, instinct drove Elora to hurl herself into the raging torrent within her and battle her way to the crest of surging fire. There she had to ride it, as in childhood from her tower she'd seen the young men of Angwin do the surf off Point Redoubt. To her advantage, she'd spent much of the past few years as an apprentice to Torquil, master forger of the Rock Nelwynds. She'd proved herself a gifted student. Indeed, of all the cardinal elements, fire came most naturally to her. There was no margin for error. She knew that she now possessed the power required for healing even a mortal wound, but she couldn't dally over any of them. The task had to be accomplished with this single rush of blood and flame, one complete circuit of her body from heart to heart, to make herself once again physically whole. Rage paled within her, the Malavoy mountains receding almost to insignificance. By her own will, she shaped this fire into a force for creation, treating her own body the way she would a pour of molten metal. There came a moment, late in the process, when she faced the choice of every forge master, whether to bring forth pure metal, unsullied by flaw, or find a way to turn those same potential liabilities to her benefit. As with an alloy, she could purge the Malavoy taint from her soul with such a blast of fire that it would never return. "Thou art the Danon," the Malavoy had said, and a gust of rage sparked such prominences of flame at how like its voice her own sounded speaking its words. After a fierce struggle, she managed to restore herself to a semblance of grace for the final surge of effort. The experience left her shaken, but more determined to prevail as she repeated the rest of what the Malavoy told her. The 13th realm that binds all others. The Malavoy were no domain, like the Nelwynds or Fire Drakes. They were a great realm entire, the pinnacle of the circle of the flesh, the point of linkage between that circle and that of the spirit. Cast on aside, Elora's cause was lost. Thought and action occurred as one, just as her wave crashed once more into the heart that was its source. It was a memory of Torquil Ufgood that pointed the way for her. "Purity's an ideal," he said, his voice as befit as his barrel chest. "So's perfection. Something we strive for, but never achieve. That's for the best, and you ask me, how can you have perfection when you've a mind to consider the possibility of something new, and mayhap better? The most pure and perfect thing can carry within it the seeds of its own destruction. Some roads it's the flaws that make the difference, and make a body interesting." "Life is growth," Elora said. "Growth is change. Change is chaos." I hope that's a good thing, Elora, what you just said. A familiar voice, neither Thorn nor the brownies. But I'd have to warn ye, my master, he'd challenge ye square on any proposition that chaos were good. The voice came from one side of her. From the other, her hand registered sensations that were at once cool and warm. Hot breath blew up her arm, exhorting her to open her eyes and rejoin the world. She saw who was there, and promptly closed them, wishing for the strength to curl herself into a tiny ball and retreat under the covers, until both she and the young man perished of old age. Elora reached after him, but her hand got tangled in the duvet, forcing her to call out, "Luke John, where are you going?" The young scribe had already reached the door to her room. "Seeing as you're awake, Laura, I figured I'd summon Master Drumheller. If I'm truly awake, he'll know it and come along himself, as will the brownies." She wanted to sit up, but wasn't sure she had the strength. "I look a fright," she muttered. "Life is chaos," agreed Luke John. She gave him the response he deserved by sticking out her tongue and trying to disappear into the deepest recesses of her bed. Sadly, his hound demanded some attention of his own. "Puppy!" she squealed in delight, as a pair of massive paws landed beside her on the bed. Luke John's wolfhound levered himself up and over to run his great tongue across Elora's face. "Someone looks fair proud of himself," chided Luke John as he hunted up a chair. "He's feeling cocky," Elora said. "He thinks he's got the girl." There was no real comparison between these hounds and other dogs. In the oldest days, the great Highland wolfhound was conceived for one supreme task, to stand against the death dogs of the Malavoy, and ultimately the Malavoy themselves. "It was you, puppy," Elora murmured, too quietly for Luke John to hear. "The growl I heard when the Malavoy reached out to me." "Puppy's the reason I'm here," Luke John said. Such a compliment. He blushed, and seeing his reaction, so did Elora, praying the shadows of the thick quilt hid the sight from him. "I'm hungry," she announced. "That's no surprise. What shall I bring yus?" "Porridge to start, with cinnamon, and then—" "We'll see how you feel," announced Thorn with his entrance. For the time it took to produce the porridge, Thorn subjected Elora to a comprehensive medical examination, employing the purely physical skills of a physician as well as the more specialized tools of a sorcerer. Both disciplines pronounced Elora fully recovered. Sadly, this didn't prevent her from nearly falling flat on her face as she clambered out of bed, intent on a long, luxurious soak in steaming water. The tub was delicious, sized large enough that she could actually float in it. Thorn stayed in the room with her. "I can manage here on my own," she protested. "I've cared for you, girl, since you were in wrappings," Thorn said, by way of explanation. "It's an old habit I'm loath to give up just yet. Sorry." Elora took refuge by dunking herself beneath the surface. Before she'd soaped the top half of her body, she felt like she'd worked a full day in Torquil's forge, shifting blocks of ore without the aid of winches. She was actually grateful when the Nelwyn took a scrub brush to her back. When he went to work on her scalp, Elora felt pampered and delicious. Because the sensations were all positive, she felt safe, not noticing when her awareness began to drift. Thorn did. He was on the lookout for just such a lapse, but seeing that she was in no real danger, he took no action. For Elora, the water changed texture, refreshingly cool where before it had felt near to boiling. There was life around her, made plain by the tickling of fingerlings between her toes. Her perceptions had widened from her tub to the cascadel running past the fort. She felt the water racing over the riverbed, and, at the same time, was one with the earth that formed the bed. She felt new channels being etched in the river bottom, which created wild new currents to make these upland rapids more untamable. There was a heaviness to the earth that was new to her, a strange and continuous sort of pounding. Intrigued, she pushed her perceptions upstream, noting as she went a growing absence of fish. The farther she progressed, the more curiosity turned to concern, and she felt Thorn's awareness focus with hers. They both noticed when the water turned foul, and not long after she learned why. Waste matter, a lot of it, transforming this once pristine stream into a monumental sewer. At the same time, Elora's perceptions caught little evidence of land-born life. No deer, elk, not even rabbits. All that could be classed as prey had fled, and as well the predators who hunted them, save one. She stopped. In the tub, Elora lay still, while Thorn knelt, hands cupping her head. Frangine and Rule hunkered watchfully on the counter by the wash basin, while Luke John stood just inside the door, the promised porridge bowl growing cold in his hands. Far upriver, an astral projection of Elora crept ashore. By rights, in this form, she should be undetectable, but she took no chances. "There's nothing here," Thorn reported, after casting wide his own insight. "I know," Elora agreed. "That's just it. Not only are there no animals, but where are the peoples of Lesser Fairy? Why haven't they reported this poisoning of the river? The trees around us are hollow, without spirit. They're just wood. No brownies, fairies, boggarts. What there is here is what we see with ordinary sight, nothing more." "How do you want to proceed, Elora?" "Carefully, old duffer." She looked around them, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "What's so special about this stretch of river? Why draw us ashore here?" "Isn't the road yonder?" Thorn asked. Elora nodded, and was taking her first step toward it, when Thorn's astral hand caught her arm. "Wait!" She heard nothing, but that was no surprise. Nelwyn ears were keener than Daikini, even in phantom bodies. Dimly, Elora caught the rhythmic tread of boots moving in a quick military cadence that she identified as a jog trot. A dozen men approaching from upriver. Another sound presented itself as a counterpoint to the marching feet, that of tiny bells, 13 in all, the stroke of their chimes telling Elora they were part of something being carried. "They move fast," she commented, as the party drew abreast of them. The marchers began a chant, low and sonorous, striking resonances more in common with a horn. Whatever the men were carrying was tall, and it took long, solid strides, planting its legs like pilings that could never be dislodged. Elora shifted her position, deliberately masking Thorn from view, hoping her magic immunity would stand her in good stead. The stratagem was sound, but there was risk. The stranger might seek them out with ordinary sight. Her astral form was still, after all, striking in appearance. A rippling cha-ching marked a stir from the stranger. Somehow, Elora was glad she had no weapon at hand. The temptation to race, shrieking into battle, would have been irresistible. Then came another cascade of chimes, the chuff of retreating footfalls as the bearers once more took up their burden. Without any command, they continued on their way. In fairly short measure, they faded beyond Elora's hearing. Thorn didn't relax, but tugged her elbow toward the river. "Quickly," Thorn told her. "Let us be gone, and be more careful than before," he cautioned, "because we'll have to pass them on our way home." "What are they?" "Barrelties, and if the tales are true, a Caliban. The one are lesser sorcerers, forming a coven around the creature they serve. The other, the ultimate warrior wizard, as adept with enchantments as with blades." "Like the Black Rose, you mean? If only. Come, we're gone." But to both their surprise, Elora pulled from Thorn's grasp, stepped forward from their hiding place. "Elora!" Thorn cried. "Someone died here, Thorn." She lowered herself to her belly, stretching full length as though the ground were the softest of feather beds. Elora tweaked her concentration, loosening the metal bonds that anchored her to the world, and sank beneath its surface. It was much the same as swimming under water. The main difference was that water moved around her as she passed through it, whereas the ground stayed relatively fixed. She didn't have far to go. It was a man, Daikini, strongly built. His death had caught him unawares, leaving no marks on his body. Elora assumed he died in his sleep. In short order, she confirmed her worst fears, that he hadn't died alone. Mage sight guided her way, illuminating bodies arranged in a line along a lengthy trench. All had been stripped of their outer garments and weapons. She thought then of the creature Thorn had named, the Caliban, and wondered what part it had played in this massacre. Then she came across a man she knew. "Fergal!" she breathed, staring into his clouded eyes. He was a patrol sergeant, mainstay of the regiment, the kind of soldier who would never win prizes for deportment, but also knew the frontier like it was his own private preserve. In a scrap, it was said, there was none better to stand at your back. His skill, knowledge and blood hadn't saved him, or his men. Elora's eyes burned with fury, and the ground around her trembled at the Caliban's approach. She slithered, eel-like, into the air to rejoin Thorn. The night ringed with chimes, telling her the Caliban was closing faster than she would have expected, given his bulk. His bearers, the Barontes, flanked him on either side. The path to the river was still clear. If they hurried, escape was possible. It was a superb trap. Elora almost fell for it, but Thorn caught her eyes before she could take a step. She leaned on him, gathering Thorn close the way she used to hold her stuffed bear, and plunged the pair of them back into the ground. A blast of rage thundered after them, as tangible to their phantom forms as an avalanche, and it took a fair chunk of Thorn's will combined with Elora's to keep them from being tumbled. A hand came after, and Elora prayed it was only imagination that tipped its fingers with claws sharp enough to slice soul from body. Elora's special affinity for fire brought her to a rill of magma that coursed its way through the planetary mantle as water did across the surface. She slipped and slid her way along, following the course of the stream. She perceived a beacon far ahead, recognizing it as the grouped life forces of the fort's inhabitants. She had perhaps a moment to marvel at the wondrous mix of hues that she had never seen before in this world, and then had to bend all her efforts to twisting free of the torrent before she was swept past her destination. For those in the bath chamber, there was no warning. Elora lay in the tub, with Thorn supporting her head, both barely breathing. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of lungs gulping in a tremendous breath of air. Elora's skin flushed an angry rose beneath its hallmark silver, Thorn's turning likewise with the fierce onrush of blood. The water began to boil, and those closest to the tub sprang back, Luke John making a desperate grab for Thorn to yank him clear before the Nailwind could be burned. With Drumheller safe, he turned back for Elora, but she was already vaulting free of the tub, to land in a huddle in a far corner of the room. When Luke John turned toward her, she warned him back with a flail of her hands, as though she couldn't yet trust her body to behave. "Drumheller," she called. "Thorn, are you all right? Luke John, is he well?" "I'm fine, Elora Dannon," came the Nailwind's reply. "Bedazzled, I confess, but otherwise altogether well." "I've never done that with another," Elora confessed. Luke John held out a robe, which Elora gratefully struggled into, belting it tight around her waist. She found it hard to look at Luke John, suddenly uncomfortable that he'd seen her naked. "Done what?" asked Luke John, and Elora saw that he felt much the same. "Ridden a rapids of fire, my boy," Thorn told him, "through the bowels of the earth, in flight from a creature too terrible to name." Outside, a trumpet sounded to announce the approach of friendly forces. "What's that?" Elora demanded of Luke John. "Most likely the scouting force back from the upper reaches of the Cascadale." Before he had finished his sentence, Elora bawled her way out the door, Luke John's hound on her heels. She raced outside to find herself at the opposite end of the war yard from the main gate. In her mind's eye, imagination revealed what couldn't yet be seen, a troop of 100 cavalry approaching double file in good order. She didn't pause. Somehow, she found the wherewithal to actually increase her speed, drawing on the fullest depths of her reserves to sprint across the yard. "Elora Dannon!" squawked a protest in one ear, the elegantly clad brownie it came from struggling for purchase on her shoulder. A flick of the eyes revealed that Rule rode on her right-hand side. "You move fast," he told her proudly. "We move faster. Jumped aboard as you went by." Then he sounded a tad scandalized. "Didn't even notice you. Just because you've been sick, think you can forget all we taught you?"
"Had enough of this. You go gallivanting about all by your lonesome," said Frangine. "Makes us look bad, it does, like we can't properly discharge our duties. You go, we go with, and there's the end to it. Can't do a decent job as your protectors, with you always trying to leave us behind." "Sound the alarm!" she bellowed to the guardhouse, ignoring her diminutive companions. "Close the gates, it's a trick. Those riders are imposters." If the sentries heard her, they didn't believe. Not right away. Some heads turned at the sight of Elora, this lean silver figure racing for the gates with a wolfhound. Puppy let loose a howl that raised the hackles on every neck. Few had ever heard such a noise, because precious few had ever seen these magnificent beasts at war, but all recognised the sound, those of Fairy as well as the Daikini, and hearing it, found themselves grabbing for weapons. The hound bayed a second time, and this time his clarion call was taken up by his fellow pack members. One, then half a dozen, the whole of his extended family, some taking up the charge to join him, while others hung back to form a second line of defence. Even though the actions within the fort were hidden from outside view, some element of Elora's headlong dash must have communicated itself to the approaching patrol, for they spurred their mounts into a gallop. The young woman didn't slow her pace, even when a few sentries stepped forward to block her path. All she dodged, with an ease that left the soldiers flat-footed in her wake. Elora spared herself breath for one last cry, and this was with the voice she'd learned in Angwin, watching the king, and later in battle, listening to his daughter, Anakari. "Close the gate!" she yelled, noting that the onrushing riders had spread out into a rough arrowhead formation. Behind and far away, she made out the belated sound of the alarm tocsin, shouted orders, the bustle of soldiery reacting too late to the attack. Someone at last had recognised the cavalry charge for what it was. Then, Elora reached once more to the earth that had so often sustained her, and set loose another charge of magma from her heart, giving fire to her blood and strength to every muscle. With a bellow of defiance, she swung her spear for the rider to her left. He ducked, and the blade whisked past his ear in a clean miss. Sadly, he wasn't her intended target, as she reversed the grip of her hands and thrust the butt of her staff sideways into the body of the man who headed the spear point of the charge. Caught unaware, the impact stopped him in his tracks, the shock transmitting itself down the shaft of the spear and into Elora's shoulders like a direct physical blow. The rider was catapulted from his saddle. She gave no thought to the man she deliberately missed. He had troubles of his own, as did many of his fellows, as Puppy and his pack went for riders. She heard a cry, panic and pain mixed, as a trooper was tackled by Elora's wolfhound. All around her, the attack dissolved into chaos. The brownies made their own contribution, losing arrow after arrow from their bows. With the horses, they weren't as blunt, choosing lances that stung rather than bludgeoned. Elora had no hope of actually stopping the attack, even with everyone's help. The odds against them were simply too great, and precious time had been lost. Not much in objective terms, hardly more than a minute, but militarily that proved a fatal delay. A squad of infantry formed ranks outside the gate, advancing to Elora's support, ready to sacrifice their own lives in her defence. But the gate itself remained infuriatingly open, and the thought chilled Elora that perhaps treachery was involved here. That thought was nearly her last, as a frantic back pedal barely cleared her from a wild sword swing, a miss so close that her robe was sliced open across the width of her belly. She was already swinging the butt of her spear around to crack the man upside his head when another figure rose from the ground. Luke John wrenched the warrior's sword from his unconscious grasp and took a stance at Elora's back. The next few moments were for them both a continuous flow of movement, bobbing, spinning high, crouching low, Elora using her spear as club, breaking bones when she had to, drawing blood where there was no other choice. The battle became for her a kind of dance, possessing a murderous beauty that at once repelled and excited. Facing the abyss of death, she had never felt more alive, eyes sparkling, grin on her face. By her side, Luke John wielded his sword with a rough-hewn skill that matched his appearance. A trumpet sounded, and the ground trembled with the sudden cavalcade of hooves. Behind Allura, cavalry from within the fort broke forth to join the fray. With their assault, the gates of Fort Tregar finally swung shut. With their arrival, the tide of battle turned for good.